Namaskar and welcome to Sansad Television. I am Vishal Dahiya and you're watching our special show Perspective, where we bring you detailed analysis of all key national and international issues. Today, we're going to talk about the COP26 Summit and specifically the issue of climate equity. Now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Monday addressed COP26 World Leaders Summit in Glasgow, where he made a critical pitch for climate action and stood for the nations of the developing world as well. While delivering his national statement on India's behalf, Prime Minister Modi also presented 5 commitments from India towards climate action at COP26. These include taking its non-fossil fuel energy capacity to 500 gigawatt by 2030, fulfilling 50% of its energy requirements through renewable energy by 2030, bringing down carbon intensity of its economy by more than 45% by 2030, and cut down its net projected carbon emission by 1 billion tons from now until 2030. India will also achieve the target of net zero carbon emission by 2070. India has been pushing for climate equity in terms of actions which need to be taken by the developed countries to achieve climate and energy goals. In fact, according to the Climate Equity Monitor, which tracks various aspects of climate change, countries including the United States, Russia, Australia, and most European nations have exceeded their fair share of global carbon budget, whereas India, China, and countries from Africa and South America have consumed less than their fair share. Now, the carbon debt values for developed countries clearly indicate their responsibility and the massive carbon debt they owe to the rest of the world. And for more on this, we're joined by a distinguished panel of experts. We'll try and understand how exactly the carbon equity can be achieved and what's happening at COP26, also India's commitments therein. And for more on this, we're joined by Madhura Joshi here in the studio. She is Senior Associate with E3G. We're also joined by Urmi Goswami, Assistant Editor, Economic Times. She's joining us from Glasgow, there in Scotland, where COP26 is taking place. And we also have with us Mr. Ravi Shankar Prasad. He's the Additional Chief Secretary with the Government of Assam, but he's also been India's Chief Negotiator with climate change and environment issues from 2013 to 2021. Welcome, all of you, to Sansad TV. Let me begin with you, Urmi, and let's first start by taking stock of what's happening on the ground there. Indian Prime Minister made a very passionate pitch there, passion statement, putting in, light India's commitments, specific commitments there, and obviously the renewed, pitch from India in terms of climate equity.
Of course, the fact that India announced a net zero target last night, 2070 itself, was a bit of a big news. There had been a lot of push to get India and basically every country to announce a net zero. India, of course, being a big economy, number 4 on the big emitters list, was one of the countries that was getting a fair bit of push. When India, therefore, made its announcement, it also made its announcement keeping its own considerations in mind. 2070 is, of course, not what 2050 the world was pushing for, but it's very clear. That's where part of the equity concern comes in. And also the basic structure of the Paris Agreement, where every country has the autonomy to do what it needs to do for its development and for the climate. So 2070 target itself was a bit of a big news here in Glasgow last night. And of course, the other part of the story is India's 2030 commitments. Mm-hmm. Now, where there's a lot of questions, there are a lot of details that yet need to be filled vis-a-vis the 2070 target. We can see there is a ramping up of our near target. That's the 2030 target. As you mentioned, the renewable energy target, which is now, we have moved from a 40% commitment to make 40% of our energy basket non-fossil fuel to 50% of our energy market to renewable. That's a big shift. Mm-hmm. That basically leaves out nuclear, big hydro. So that's a huge shift. Also increasing our non-fossil fuel to 500 gigawatts. That's again a bigger shift.
Okay.
There is this thing about commitment made for 1 billion, for the reduction of 1 billion tons of carbon emissions. We need more details on that, but on the whole, it shows India not only stepping up, but stepping up with keeping in mind its own requirement and the issues of equity. Another critical piece of the announcements last night is the Prime Minister putting his and India's weight behind the demand from the developing world for sort of more climate finance. Recently, the Africa Group had put out a proposal, a calculation that said $1.3 trillion.
Okay.
This is the $1.1 trillion that the Prime Minister said that the developed world should provide. I presume and I believe is in line with that.
Okay.
He did clearly make one. He made one thing very clear, and I think that it's one of the most significant pieces of his speech, which has got less attention, and where he says that the developing world has stepped up. It's stepped up with its actions. We may not always like all the actions that are taken. We may want more, but we have developing world has stepped up. It is now time for the developed world to step up with their end of the promise.
That's a very important aspect there, Urmi. Something which we'll talk about in the next round as well, in terms of what developing world has been doing, these developing countries have been doing, and what is it that the developed nation need to do in terms of actions which need to be taken on the ground. Mr. Prasad, I'd like to bring you in here. You've been closely involved with the negotiations for almost 8 years. What we would like to understand is the road to these commitments which have been made by India. And as Urmi was pointing out, India has taken a firm stand, came out very clear, and it's also an indication of how the developing countries are willing to take tough decisions.
I would like to say that the announcements made by the Honorable Prime Ministers were very much in line with the proactive actions that India has been taking on climate change. And during the last few years since the Paris Agreement, there has been further impetus to climate action in India. One part of the announcement, that is the 2070 carbon neutrality goal, is not something that is called for by the Paris Agreement. What is required by the Paris Agreement is global peaking of emissions and rapid fall thereafter in the early part of the 21st century. Mm-hmm. That is also to be based on equity and CBDRC, which is the abbreviation for common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Therefore, it is something that India has always advocated. We have always been ahead of many other countries in terms of climate action. And if we look at the historical responsibilities at the rate of emissions of different parts of the world, our response is much better than what we see in the developed world. We are expecting a better deal on the climate finance part, on technology transfers, on market mechanism, which will be a very important part of the entire range of decisions which this COP is supposed to take.
Okay, fair enough. So clearly it looks like, India has set the ball rolling there. Now, Madhura, you've been keeping a close watch on what's happening as well vis-a-vis all these challenges which have to be tackled on the issue of climate change. Not just about India. And when we look at India, clearly India is making its commitments pretty much known, pretty much clear. There is a clear path, there is a clear plan to go ahead and achieve those commitments as well. What is the signal, or what's the feeling which we're getting from other nations as well, specifically the developed countries?
So just to clarify, signals about India's commitment or what they plan to do
overall
themselves?
Their commitment as well, and vis-a-vis the developing countries also.
Absolutely. So I think let me start by saying that there has been an acknowledgement even in the leaders' commitments and speeches that were made that accelerated action now is required. And the world has not kept up with the pledges that are needed to reach a 1.5 degree scenario by the end of the century. The UNEP study that came out showed that there is at least a 26 to 28 billion tons gap in the kind of commitments that are required to help us put on that 1.5 trajectory pathway to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So I think that there is a step up in action and commitments that are taking place. We've seen that now through the host of announcements that have been made at COP and in the lead up to COP. To give you an example, when the Paris Agreement was signed, there were at least, I think, 450 gigawatts of coal power project pipeline, and that has collapsed by more than 74% between just 2015 and now. Countries have stepped up with their net zero commitments. There are at least over 80%, now 84%, I think, with India joining in, who've committed to net zero targets. More and more countries are setting targets for phasing out coal. There's methane pledge that has been put in place. Are all of these actions sufficient? Science tells us, no, we will need to accelerate our actions, and this will need to also be backed by finance and financial commitments by developed countries, not just for mitigation, but also for adaptation.
Okay.
But I'm hopeful about the progress that has been made so far and the progress that I see technology and private investors making in this decade going ahead.
Okay. Urmi, your views there on these two important aspects, as Madhura is also pointing out, and these are the key issues when we are looking at what needs to be done on the ground. Just commitments to the net zero emissions or, increasing the share of renewable energy might not be just enough vis-a-vis the developed countries. They will also have to do more or commit more in terms of the climate financing, providing clean technology as well for ensuring clean energy to the developing world. Where do you think it's going in terms of the words being spoken by the leaders of the developed countries there and what their paper says in terms of commitments?
Before we just step into that, I want to clarify one thing, is that when we talk about a net zero, we look at emissions. That's a metric we look at. But net zero is actually a composite. It's actually a stand-in for the kind of radical transformation that is required so that the planet can actually be exactly the way it is,
okay,
and the situation not get worse. And therefore, in a sense, the game changes a little bit. Everybody needs to do way much more than they're doing. Now, we are saying, and we have said, and we have shown that India and other developing countries are doing much more. They're punching above their weight. Now, when you bring in the question of what others, that is the developed world, should do, clearly everybody needs to punch above whatever their weight is. And there should be a better flow of finance to adaptation, to taking on consideration issues like loss and damage. All that needs to happen.
Okay.
But look at it the other way. The fact like a country like India steps up, and if we can provide a clearer roadmap, because that the devil is in the details. We have said 2070. What the 2070 includes, we don't know yet. We are waiting for more details. That should be the lever with which to put pressure for better flows of finance, for better partnerships for technology. Maybe the system of money, of financial assistance, or financial support will change. We will have more private. We will have to have more private participation. But the fact is that with us pushing on, with us saying that we want to do more and we will do more, it should create that kind of pressure saying, okay, we said we'll do more, but fact is that we have issues. We need assistance. We need help. Where is that assistance?
Okay.
Till now, you could talk about it in terms of an ideological conversation. You have now moved it into practice. You say, okay, this is what we plan. This is what we need to keep the temperature rise to 1.5. But we don't have the money. We don't have the technology. Where are you with it? So it's like you have a proper plan and you know how to push back. I think that is what we need to do as developing countries.
Okay.
They have a plan to push, have a clearer way of making your demands, rather than just an ideological demand, which is important. But now we need to flesh it out because the situation is dire.
Okay. So engagement is really, really important when we're talking about climate equity. They are making those responsible, step up and make more commitments as well. Mr. Prasad, your views there on, the issue of climate financing, on the issue of developed nations or those who have been more responsible for polluting the environment, stepping up, taking responsibility and lending a helping hand to the others as well, because it's a world wherein we will have to work together to find these solutions. The question of climate equity.
I'll mention two particular assessments which have been done by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. One is the Biennial Assessment of Finance, which was done for the year 2018, and also the NDC Synthesis Report. Now, the Biennial Assessment Report on Finance clearly brings out that the actual flow of funds from the developed countries to developing countries amounts to only $38 billion, that too by somewhat relaxed criteria adopted by the UNFCCC. If we look at the actual flow of funds from multilateral institutions meant for climate finance like the GCF or the Adaptation Fund, it is much less. And therefore, we find that a lot of finance flows, which are through the World Bank or any other multilateral institution, are being repackaged as climate finance. So there is a important issue there regarding what is counted as climate finance, what really the developing countries are looking for. And as Urmi has pointed out, adaptation finance and loss and damage are much less in comparison to the mitigation finance. If we look at the breakup, it will be around 75-25 or 65-35. 65 going for mitigation actions. In terms of the NDC synthesis report, what we see is that the developed countries who have really pledged the 2050 carbon neutrality goal, if we add up their commitments there, it really doesn't add up to much. It is not even leading to 100% reduction in emissions. What they are trying to do is to shift the emission burden to developing countries. Now, if you talk of net zero, it means that a country can keep emitting and it will purchase carbon credit from other countries and show itself to be net zero. It may be beneficial to some developing countries, but if we are looking at a global scale, what does net zero in 2050 mean? Who will purchase from whom and who will sell to whom? Because if it is the entire world which is engaging in these kind of transactions, it is very difficult to find buyers and sellers at the same time for these kind of transactions. My independent assessment is that the developed countries should have peaked much earlier and should become carbon neutral by 2030. Otherwise, they keep occupying the carbon space, which, as Madhura has just pointed out, will mean that the developing countries will be crowded out of the carbon space. They will not have any carbon space in the coming years. It will be captured by the developed countries. So there is a whole issue of equity. There is a whole question of historical responsibilities. There is a question of how do we see this trajectory of moving away from carbon, fossil fuels to renewable sources, etc., in a short time frame rather than in a longer time frame of 2050 or more. So it is the action now which is more important, and therefore what the Honorable Prime Minister has announced is very relevant. We are upping the game in the near future, which is 2030. We are committing what additional things will be done by India by 2030, and that is what I think the other countries should also do.
Okay. Madhura, you were earlier speaking about the finance part, the climate financing, and as Mr. Prasad, explained in a wonderful way that the problem lies with the adaptation part. Most of the spending is happening on the mitigation.
Right.
But unless we spend more on adaptation, we will have to keep on spending more on mitigation.
We do need a step change in increase in adaptation funds, and this is something that has been put forth very strongly by small island nation countries, by LDCs as well. And there is actually a call by the UNSG as well to step up significantly the money that goes in for adaptation, particularly for those nations and countries who are already facing the challenges of climate crisis, and it's going to worsen as we go ahead. So mobilizing public and private finance that goes into adaptation is going to be very critical in helping these countries, particularly post-COVID, which has already ravaged a lot of economies. It'll help these countries in building resilience in their economies.
Okay. So resilience is required there, and obviously the adaptation part. But let's come to the final issue here. And Urmi, since you're there in Glasgow and taking a closer look at what's happening, all of us are very eager to understand and, analyze also that what might be the tangible achievements when we talk about COP26. Few more days to go.
Well, there is still a pretty long way to go, and the days will just get longer. But COP26 has a couple of priorities. The COP Presidency, that the United Kingdom has a couple of priorities, which includes keeping 1.5, the temperature goal of 1.5 within reach, ensuring climate finance, and focusing on the 100 billion, which was the promise made in Copenhagen and reiterated in the Paris Agreement. And also they're looking at, of course, the net zero commitment is there. Now, the issue is, in terms of, and of course, finishing the remainder of the Paris rules of the carbon market, rules for the carbon market, some issues on transparency, and some reporting issues that need to be completed here.
Okay.
Are we going to get that? Well, there has been some progress, it seems, overnight on the markets negotiation and on some of the reporting negotiations. So, well, again, as I said, it's early days. But I think the most tangible thing that we can walk away with from COP26 is that countries have stepped up. We may not like the amount they've stepped up. We may expect them to do more, especially developing countries.
Okay.
But now it is time to work in unison. This is actually a global problem, not a problem of one country or another. As the Prime Minister put it last night, that when he went to Paris to make a commitment on behalf of India, he did it not just for India's sake, but also because of its place in the world. But it was also about ourselves. And I think that is a critical lesson critical point we should be taking from.
Okay.
What is this? We tend to look at either a net zero sort of announcement or enhanced NDCs as commitments, as demands made on us. But it's actually a signal to our own economy, a signal to our own society that it is time for a radical change. The Prime Minister talks about lifestyle changes. All of it is encompassed in that. It is about taking a hard look at how we do our economy, how we have our tax systems. Is it time to align that into a system that is more in balance with the planetary boundaries, and therefore, more sustainable and better for people, and definitely for people like ours, many of whom are still living in poverty. And I think that is a critical thing to take away. When we step back and make an assessment of what happened at COP26 globally and individually as countries, we need to realize how has this moment helped us make that transition, not for anybody else, but for our own country. India has the possibility of becoming a leader, not just because it's taking action, but leader in terms of creation of technology, of finding of different low-cost ways of addressing adaptation issues. All of that is there, but it cannot do so alone. After all, this is a global problem, and it does take a village to solve problems like this.
Indeed, Urmi, what you're pointing out vis-a-vis India's statements and India's position there is pretty much clear. Let me have a quick concluding comment from Mr. Prasad also in terms of, what might be the best possible outcome here, Mr. Prasad, because you've been involved with negotiations. These are very complicated and complex negotiations which take place. But at the end of the day, it's about the future of our planet.
I think every COP has an agenda. There are subsidiary bodies which have a well-drawn agenda ahead of them. And 3-4 issues which are very critical for this COP to decide on is the Article 6, the market mechanism, which will set in place a successor to the clean development mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. The second is trying to look at the new finance goal. That work also needs to be initiated because in the Paris Agreement, it was agreed that the countries will now look for a post-2020 finance goal and therefore work on that based on the country's needs and assessments also needs to be kicked in. That will help a lot in building trust among the parties and bringing all together in looking towards the future. The third aspect, which is also important, is preparations for the global stocktake. Now, global stocktake is a process which is to be completed by 2023. and now the preparations for that has to be launched in the sense that we need to have clear thoughts on how the assessment of mitigation actions, adaptation actions, the means of implementation part are all going to be collated, and how they will feed into the global stocktake process for the world to decide on the new round of NDCs post 2023.
Okay.
So these are all important agenda items which need to be pushed forward.
Okay.
And I'm sure that with the involvement of all parties, we should be making progress on each of these issues, and each of them in their own way will be contributing to the solutions for the climate problem.
Okay.
And I hope that if these agendas are concluded successfully and the Paris Agreement work program is closed, it will also be a very good signal to the world community about the clear commitment of all of us towards climate action.
Okay, indeed, those are the key issues there, which we'll keep a close watch on. Thank you so much, Mr. Prasad. Urmi, thank you for taking out time from Scotland there, and so Madhura for sharing your views and insight with us and our viewers. As our experts were pointing out, clearly climate change is a big challenge, and there are various aspects to it. Several aspects which are being taken care of by countries individually, but a global united front also needs to be put up on this issue, something which is being debated and discussed at COP26. And the key aspect obviously remains climate financing, and the emissions part will eventually fructify once the developing nations do get that helping hand from the developed countries as well, something which we are calling climate equity. We'll come back again with a different aspect of climate change and a different topic. Till then, keep watching Sansad Television. Thank you.